Okay, welcome. So today we're trying a different format. Previous meetings we've tried Google Meets. This one's we're giving live stream a go. Love to get any feedback. Please leave them in the comments. If you've got any comments during the actual call, then just feel free to leave it in the chat session, and we'll try and get to it live. If you've got there is a homepage now in the YouTube channel, so if you want to leave comments for the next Hookup in advance, just feel free. There's a discussion group. Just find the discussion for the appropriate session and leave any comments or questions you've got, and we'll check through them to make sure we get them answered in the next call. But we also, just to let you know, that the previous 2 recorded sessions are now up on the YouTube channel as well. So you can go to the channel and check those ones out if you haven't seen them before. I just heard a whole lot of alerts come up saying that my internet connection dropped out just at the perfect time. So hopefully this is back live again. That's a bit of a great. Our internet in the Bay Area has been dodgy, unfortunately, recently. There seems to be a few more people using it these days, so hopefully this is all going again. So the schema.org has recently updated and released version, I think it's version 7. There's been a number of different releases of it recently. What in particular, it's got some new status values related to COVID announcements. So there's like for events, there's new statuses to say what the state of the event is and so forth. So it's, if you're interested in structured data, of trying to get data out. And the advantage of structured data is tools like Google can understand the site and the data about it better and do better things with it. The other quick one is the offline2on.com site. It's been undergoing a number of work. This is not a Google-related initiative, but it is an e-commerce-related initiative where a number of volunteers or professionals, primarily in the Magento, Shopify, BigCommerce space, have been getting together to try and help small business. And so that's offline, OFFLINE, number 2, on.com. They've got some more information. They've got some offers up. And so while this particular call is intended for e-commerce developers, if you know of any small businesses or got any friends or got any contacts, that may be a site worth sharing with them to help them get online. It's still very new, but they're doing great things. And the site's certainly good quality. They've got a great video up there, and they've got like over 1,000 volunteers in the first week. So it's certainly an active project. But the focus of this week, and we've got a special guest joining us today, who's Jeff Posnick. Do you want to give yourself a quick introduction, Jeff?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Alan. Alan mentioned, my name is Jeff. I am based out of New York. I'm a member of Google's Web Developer Relations team, same team that Alan's on. I am calling in from my bedroom for obvious reasons, so stay safe, everybody. And yeah, it was a really nice opportunity that Alan presented. I've off and on done site reviews / site audits, things like that at events like Chrome Dev Summit or Google I/O. A lot of times, people walk up and we'll do an in-person audit, and that is not feasible nowadays. So doing kind of a virtual audit with a few volunteers from the community seemed like a nice thing to do. And yeah, I'm gonna run through that in a little bit. Just some more background on what else I do. I spend a lot of my time working with service worker tooling, and specifically the Workbox project. So probably will not talk about it too much today within the context of these site audits, but quick shout out if you are looking to kind of take a site and add in some service worker offline first capabilities. Workbox might be able to help you with that.
Cool. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to hand it over to you, Jeff. I'll let you share screen or anything you need to do at the time. If anybody's got any comments or questions during it, just drop them into the chat. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat as best I'm able to and interrupt and bring them over to him. But I think I'm just going to hand it over to you, Jeff. So take it away.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to start screen sharing right now. And let's see. Hopefully folks are able to see something at this point. I'm going to, we have Alan's video here. Put that in the corner for now. Cool. So I just wanted to kind of run down my normal methodology for doing this. And every site audit is different. Every site review is different. So please do not take this as hard and fast rules for how to approach it. And we also, in terms of structure, we have 3 volunteers that Alan was able to solicit from the community. I'm not honestly sure whether we'll have time to go through all of them, but we're going to start at the top with threadies.com and take it from there and see how much time we have for everything. So the way I normally start these processes is with some of our automated tooling. And when I say our, not necessarily our meaning Google, kind of the web developer community's automated tooling. One of those pieces of tooling is Lighthouse, and that is something that Google works on. Another piece of tooling and testing infrastructure is webpagetest.org/easy. And also just have some random notes, general notes. So I love just taking notes as I go. I'm going to apologize for the quality of my laptop's keyboard at this point. If you see typos or letters that are duplicated or not appearing, I blame the laptop entirely. So I'm going to just put in a couple of things here. Webpagetest.org/easy is what we're going to start with. And the other is Lighthouse. Okay. And both of these approach the question of how do you kind of get a holistic picture of a URL's performance in slightly different ways. I think one of the interesting things is a lot of developers might not just have any idea what questions to ask about why their site is fast or slow. And I've definitely been in that boat before. These will each in their own way give you a set of things to look at and kind of jumping off points for investigating site performance and best practices in more detail. And they differ in some important ways. So the first one that we're going to try, webpagetest.org/easy. I happen to have this open already in a different window. I will tell you that let me pull up this page. This is what the interface basically looks like. You put in a URL there. When you click Start Test, something really interesting happens. There is an actual physical low-end device, a Motorola G Generation 4, tested in Virginia, 400 kilobytes, 3G connection. So there's a physical device that is actually going to be loading a page, running Chrome's DevTools to kind of obtain valuable metrics about pages loading performance, and it'll spit out the results. Because this actually relies on real devices, you get much more accurate assessment of real-world performance problems and types of things that you would not necessarily get just in a more synthetic test. But it also means that there's occasionally a delay in running the test. There's a little bit of a queue that you normally go into. So in order to jump ahead of that queue and not have to have people sit and wait while we're doing this live, I ran the test already on our first site, threadies.com. Let me also just open threadies.com in another window so we know what we're talking about. And we have, here's the site that we're going to be auditing first. And the nice thing is that WebPageTest will give you a high-level overview of a few different key stats, like time to first byte, keep live press image, so on and so forth, cache static content. And then it'll start kind of really getting into the weeds with some of this detail. And we'll jump into that detail soon. Quickly, before I do that, though, I just want to point out the other tool that we're going to run a little bit later on is called Lighthouse. Lighthouse is going to give you a different kind of lens in which to look at site performance. It runs a slightly different set of tests, but it ends up running it locally on your computer or laptop or whatnot, whatever Chrome is running on. So it tries to simulate some of the things like having a slower connection or having a low-end device, but it's only a simulation of those things. So you don't necessarily get as accurate a view of what your performance would be like in the real world from running Lighthouse. But because you're running it locally on your machine, you get to run it as frequently as you want. You don't have to wait in line, on webpagetest.org to get results. And you can even do some cool things like add Lighthouse as part of your continual integration build process and get kind of a different score each time you make a change to your site in order to track regressions and things like that. So those are the two tools that we'll use. I usually use both of them and just get slightly different viewpoints about issues based on what each of them bring up. So let's, with that out of the way, kind of dig into some observations on the web page test results from Redis. So first of all, lots of A's. It's great, and it's a little difficult because we are assigning grades and we're assigning letter grades, and in the case of Lighthouse, sometimes numbers to websites. And I just wanted to start by saying everybody knows, it's unrealistic for everything to be A's. It's unrealistic to get perfect hundreds. Shipping sites in the real world mean it's making compromises, and I really like viewing these types of sessions as a way of understanding the compromises and understanding the kind of issues that might exist that you're not aware of, and then just kind of setting your expectations, setting like, here are some things that maybe I didn't even understand was an issue. Now that I know it's an issue, I can make a couple of changes and I'll see my numbers go up and get better, and I'll be like, yeah, great. On the other flip side, there are sometimes things that are just structural about, you happen to be using a certain framework, you happen to be using a certain web hosting provider. It's not trivial to change those things. I think everybody understands that, and there's only so much you can do, and the whole point of this process is to try to get incremental improvements rather than jumping from wherever you are to be A++ or anything like that. So please take these grades and the numbers, with that in mind, and we'll see these as being opportunities for improvement. So what webpagetest.org ends up doing is doing 3 different runs for you of loading your site kind of from the cold cache. And that ends up giving you kind of a way of averaging out some things that might be anomalies and kind of get a pretty representative view of what your performance is. And you can kind of throw out things that seem like they probably are not representative. So the first overall time for the homepage of Threadies.com to kind of get to the point where it was fully loaded was 37 seconds for the first run, 35 seconds for the second run, and 74 seconds for the third run. So I'm going to kind of assume that the third run is not as representative of what it would actually be on a low-end device on 3G. And I'm going to take a look at either the first run or the second run. They're probably going to show us pretty much the same things. And one of the things I really like about Web Page Test is that it offers this Filmstrip view, and this kind of takes some of these raw numbers that are kind of hard to understand from a perspective of, okay, what does it actually mean for it to be 37 seconds for my site to finish rendering completely, or finish loading completely, and it gives you a visual representation of exactly what that does mean. So it doesn't mean that you see nothing on the screen for 37 seconds and then you immediately see a flash of everything. I mean, some sites might render like that, but this particular site certainly doesn't. What it does mean is that things are progressively loading. If you know anything about the HTML structure of your page, browser is going to start parsing your HTML, start throwing up whatever it could show on the screen. Sometimes it gets to points where it has to start loading things from a third-party, CDN. Sometimes it gets to things where it has to execute a bunch of JavaScript, and that causes stuttering in the process of actually showing everything. And a lot of times that's going to be represented in this Filmstrip view. So that gives you kind of a nice way of just seeing, okay, what is the actual progressive loading experience for users on my site can be. In this particular case, you can see kind of the final bits that are coming in. I guess the final bits are coming in around the 45-second-ish mark. And it's like this, the COVID message is the last thing being rendered on the homepage, but at a certain point, let's say around 11 seconds, we actually, have our kind of hero image up. We have some material related to scrunchies on the page. So we do have something reasonable on the site at 11 seconds. It's not the full site rendered, but it is something pretty good at 11 seconds.
I just wanted to confirm, just a quick one. So this was on a 3G device. So people on their normal phones, like every day, they'd probably be more used to, particularly in the US, 4G performance. Is there a reason you picked 3G in particular?
I think that if you end up finding these things that can be optimized for 3G, they're also going to make 4G and the overall experience for most users better. It just makes it more pronounced. There are kind of things that would not be obvious if you were on 4G that do become a lot more obvious when you look at that kind of elongated loading pattern on 3G.
Okay, thank you.
You don't have to, I think for all of these things, they're not going to be things that you have to change, but they are going to be things that are opportunities. And hopefully we'll give you an ability to kind of identify whether these things are real opportunities to improve, or, if you're sure that these things are not issues, and, you don't have to actually make any changes.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But the thing I really like about this also is, like, we now have some kind of meaningful times in our head. We're like, okay, around 11 seconds, that's when we get some pretty meaningful content on the page and people start seeing stuff. And then chances are things are not going to be fully interactive for a while, but we could then match up some of those times with this particular kind of waterfall diagram, which, Web Page Test gives you, but it's also something that you might have seen if you've ever used Chrome, DevTools, Network Panel. And this just kind of shows you the beginning of each bar is when a given URL started loading. The end of each bar is when it kind of finished loading. And you can see most of the stuff that finishes like around 11 seconds. Like, this is the stuff, I almost held my finger up to the screen. Like, let's say up until like row 15 or so, that's the stuff that apparently is needed in order to get that experience that we saw at 11 seconds onto the page. And that includes like this particular image over here, so we can dive in a little bit more. I'm assuming this is the actual, the Thraves logo, for instance. So that kind of matches up with what we saw over here. So you see, row 15 at 11 seconds, that finishes loading. It takes 3 seconds to load, and that's why, 11 seconds over here, we're able to actually see that logo on the screen. And I honestly recommend everybody just at least once in the lifetime of your site, like, go through this process. You could go through it with Chrome DevTools locally, just looking at the network panel and seeing this kind of waterfall cascade of your site's resources loading. You could use this web page test interface, you could use Lighthouse, something like that. But it really helps you understand kind of the flow in which all of your resources are loading and why things appear on screen at certain times. So one of the things I kind of have in the back of my head to think about, and I'm going to take some notes here. So what's loading beforehand? So we have kind of 11 seconds as a critical part in the journey right now, and that makes me think, okay, can we move that 11 seconds maybe a little bit earlier? And one way to shift that a little bit earlier might be to load fewer things, everything that comes before 15 here. Theoretically, at that point, is competing with bandwidth, is competing with priority for the browser to show what might be a meaningful site. And some of these things are probably needed. Loading the site's CSS is almost certainly needed in order to show something meaningful, but some of these things may not be needed. So we're going to take a look at those individual resources and figure out whether there's anything we could kind of reprioritize and maybe push it a little bit later on. But what I also see is that after that, row 15 hits, and at the 11-second mark, there is a lot of stuff that starts getting loaded beyond what might be the core part of what's needed in order to display the experience. I see lots of, there's some things from Google, APIs.com, there's some things from Facebook, there are some web fonts, there's some tag manager things, Google Analytics things, there's a lot of things. And we understand that, using modern kind of web traffic analysis tools and various things that you've added to your site, it does incur this extra traffic. In this particular case, it doesn't stop you from being able to see something meaningful at 11 seconds because these are all loaded afterwards, so that's great. Sometimes that's not the case. If I see things, like Google Analytics being loaded immediately as one of a critical requests before you show anything in your site, that's usually a red flag. That doesn't appear to be happening in this particular case. But I just did want to point out that everything under here are things that you might think about, okay, I didn't realize, hey, my particular Pinterest integration ended up amounting to just using this amount of time and bandwidth on the user sites. And just use this as an opportunity to periodically reevaluate all the different widgets that are on your page and think about how many of them you actually do need, how many of them maybe can either be removed entirely if that is appropriate for your use case, or deferred with things like lazy loading, which might get a little bit beyond what we're actually able to talk about in this particular call, but I will kind of put this as a note, and maybe this would be a good topic to follow up with later. But just in terms of me taking notes for what I would circle around with, I would say, how many of the widgets, analytics, tools can be lazy loaded, potentially removed, if appropriate. Okay, so I'm going to just jump back into here a bit. This is kind of neat. This says some of the same things that we had before, but this kind of gives a final visual completeness and a few other metrics. I'm not going to necessarily jump through that now. I'm going to actually go back to the home page. Oops, not that. I'm going to go to the test result page right here, and I would like to go back to this view, and I just want to see if there's anything specific that jumps out here. As I mentioned, I would not view these as, red flags that are necessarily serious issues, but if you do see a bunch of A's, that's great. If you see a C, you see something lower, that's like, okay, let me take a quick look at that and see if there are any quick wins before I move on to looking at anything else. And if I just jump over here, this was particularly flagged by the fact that not all of the URLs that are being loaded are using proper HTTP cache expiration via the cache control header when they're being served. So I'm just going to give a quick plug. We do have some guidance about that in web.dev/reliable. I'm talking about the importance of setting cache control headers, but only so much as can actually end up being under your control. What this might end up pointing out, as it seems to be in a lot of particular URLs here, are that these are URLs that are hosted on CDNs that you do not necessarily have control over, that don't happen to be sending these cache control headers. And just really quickly, like the importance of the cache control header is just if you happen to have a URL and it's a URL that contains the hash of the contents of the resource, like in this particular case, where this is really long URL. The idea is that the contents of that URL should not change, pretty much ever, if you're properly hashing your URLs. So you, as the person who owns the web server, can tell browsers, hey, once you've downloaded this particular URL and you have, the JavaScript loaded locally, you never have to request it again. And you do that via cache control headers. They're not set on all these URLs. A lot of these URLs are for third-party widgets and things that you don't have control over. Some of these things, as a site owner, I am not 100% sure whether the site owner would have control over the CDN Shopify.com URL, but if it is something that you happen to have control over, then you might say, hey, can I go and can I flip it to start using cache control to the point where there's some guidance over here. Along with cache, and normally you would do something like this, cache control max age, blah, 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 just to say these are URLs that don't need to be revalidated for a year. So again, I don't think you're going to have the ability to do that for like this connect.facebook.net, or the Google Analytics script, unfortunately, but you can do that for some of the URLs that are flagged here that are first-party URLs. And I'm going to just take a quick look at some of the things, just circling back around while I still have this page open. I want to take a look at the things that were loaded prior to that request 15, just to see if there is anything that comes to mind as being something that can be served a little bit differently, or maybe reprioritized a little bit in order to get the page to the point where it's showing something meaningful a little bit faster. So I am going to go here, just take a quick look at some of these URLs. So it looks like we are serving things like jQuery. In this particular case, this was not flagged. I just want to make sure. The response, I think in this particular case, okay, so for these URLs that were not flagged, they are actually setting proper cache control. That's great. It means the next time the user visits your site, it's going to not have to download it from the network again, which is awesome. Taking a look at some of these other things, so this looks like a bunch of JavaScript split up into 4 different files related to themes in Shopify. I am assuming that all is necessary. I don't honestly know enough about this particular site to say whether the contents of each of these things is necessary or not, just by looking at the URLs. I can actually really quickly, though, show folks something cool that I use a lot, which kind of gives you an idea as to whether you are loading JavaScript that is not being used. And I always have trouble finding this. This is in the coverage tool over here. So I'm now out of web page test, and I'm just trying to answer that question of, is there anything maybe in those JavaScript files that are not being used at all, or maybe don't need to be loaded before your before that like 11-second mark. And I went over here into Chrome DevTools. For folks who are not familiar with Chrome DevTools, I always get to it just by pressing Command-Option-J when I have Chrome open. Brings up this interface. And then I went over here to the More tools in the pop-down. I went to Coverage, and that opened up this panel at the bottom over here. And the nice thing about this is it will actually give the opportunity to reload the page. And you can then take a look at what got downloaded and then what actually got used for the current page load. So we actually haven't interacted with the page at this point, and like the JavaScript and the CSS that ends up being used will probably change as you end up interacting and clicking on buttons. Like the JavaScript handler for the on click might actually end up being used later on. So I don't want to say that everything that's not used at this point is completely a waste, because you might be loading stuff that will be used later on, but it does give you an idea of like, maybe, hey, I'm loading too much right now, and I don't need it all to be loaded immediately. And you could see this for both CSS, so it'll show you the unused CSS on a given page, but also for JavaScript. I'm going to start by looking at just JavaScript stuff. So I could filter over here. And some of these things are, actually, instead of doing that, I'm going to try to specifically focus on some of these URLs I saw over here. So these are like CDN, Shopify.com, asset storefronts. And I think there are 4 of those. And those are kind of the biggest things I wanted to check. So I think it is CDN, Shopify.com, assets, theme. Actually, storefronts. This is some of it. Okay, this might not be all of the files, but I'm going to do CDN, Shopify.com. All right, this is a pretty good view. But what it is showing me, though, is that there are definitely some things that are fairly large. So over here, for instance, we have this vendor.js file. This is 115 kilobytes. It takes some time to download. It really, beyond taking a lot of time to download, whenever you have a JavaScript file that's fairly large like this, it takes time just to execute the JavaScript. So part of the cost that you pay for this large JavaScript is related to bandwidth and the fact that you can't download things that might be a higher priority for your site to render properly. But then you also, once you finish the download, the browser starts executing it, and the browser only has one main thread. It's going to execute whatever JavaScript is in this file, and then it's going to go to the next file, execute all that JavaScript. And all that needs to be done before your site can really be interactive to users. So, minimizing any large JavaScript files that are kind of in your critical chain is super important. So what I see here from looking at this coverage thing is that about 55% of this JavaScript just is completely unused, at least for the first rendering of the site. And similarly over here, we have this 89K file and 62 kilobytes are unused. We have a few other things over here. jQuery, 30% of jQuery is unused. Some other things here. And I realize that the site owners are not going to have complete control over some of the JavaScript that might be part of this Shopify platform. So I know that there's only so much people could do, but I did want to point out that these are some areas, that I would normally look at, and I would kind of just see if there are ways of customizing these bundles. So in this particular case, this is vendor.js. So it's presumably a bunch of different smaller JavaScript libraries all shipped together in one very large bundle that's requested unconditionally at the start of your page loading. And just figure out if there is a way of getting to the point where your page is requesting less. And the things that it is requesting hopefully ended up being shifted down the chain in that waterfall that we saw. So there's a big difference in terms of, here's the vendor.js. There's a big difference on your site's perceived performance, whether, this request is made 9th in the chain and, it has to load all the JavaScript and execute it before it can move on, or if it's loaded, 84th in the chain. So that's definitely something to think about, just kind of trying to do it a little bit of an audit based on, if you're working with a framework, if you're working with a vendor for some of these services, it might involve reaching out to them and saying, hey, I would like to ship a little less JavaScript within this critical request path for my site. So that's some of what I kind of see based on looking at the coverage. This also does give you coverage of CSS, which is kind of cool because, believe it or not, CSS can also really block any rendering of your site. It's not quite as much of a cost for parsing the CSS as there is for just the fact that you have to download what might be kind of large, in this particular case, 128 kilobytes, but then the browser has to evaluate all those rules before it will render anything. It basically blocks rendering. The browser is good about doing multiple things at the same time in some cases. It might be able to start laying out your HTML while it's doing some network requests in the background, but there are certain things like parsing and evaluating rules within a CSS file that it kind of has to pause everything related to layout in order to finish doing. So shipping less CSS as part of this kind of critical request path is also super important to get the numbers up. And in this particular case, we're saying get it from 11 seconds maybe down to 7 seconds or 6 seconds or something to get to the point where you can see something meaningful on your site. So those are some things. Let me just take quick notes about that. Use the coverage panel in Chrome DevTools to evaluate how much of your JS, CSS in the critical is being used. Just a good tip for everybody. I did want to turn to Lighthouse for a second, and I think we might end up jumping back a little bit to the web page test results at some point. But I just want to get Lighthouse's view of things, basically. And it's kind of like almost asking for a second opinion at this point, and just see what hit flags, whether there are any areas that we can then go and take a look at from the web page test point of view, and might just give us some more areas to investigate. So the way I normally kick off Lighthouse nowadays is, again, have Chrome DevTools open. It is now built into Chrome DevTools. It used to be kind of a standalone product, but if you go to the audits panel up here, you'll see a nice little Lighthouse icon and the ability to generate reports. So there are a few different things to choose over here. If you were to uncheck some of these, the report would run a little bit faster, but it's nice to just get feedback on all of them. You do have the ability to say whether you want to run your Lighthouse audit based on emulating a mobile device versus a desktop device. We did already kind of get some feedback on the mobile interface from running webpagetest.org/easy, and just, might as well choose desktop at this particular point. I'll make this slightly bigger for now, just in case there happen to be different versions of your sites that get enabled or disabled based on the viewport size. So really all this is doing is changing kind of the viewport size and that sort of thing. So I'm going to leave it mostly on the defaults. I'm going to click Generate Report. You'll see a bunch of stuff happening automatically. Lighthouse, like I mentioned at the top, kind of works by using Chrome's debugging protocols to basically script a set of actions. Just a couple of things. There's a set of sequence of events that are called a Lighthouse audit, more or less, and they try to test things that are important, things that are meaningful. And it might be loading a page, try disabling the network, reloading the page, loading the page again, see what was served from the cache. There's a whole set of audits. We're going to run through some of these now, but that's the basic idea behind Lighthouse. It tells Chrome to do certain things, it times how long they take, and then it uses that to kind of generate some grades. So we get a slightly different picture of things over here. Again, I don't want anybody to feel bad about the fact that there's a 41 for performance. First of all, this is only just one particular Lighthouse audit. You probably should run these multiple times, try to average out results, or do things like run Lighthouse as part of a continual integration process where you get results over time to see what the deltas are, maybe as being more important than what the raw grades are. That being said, it might kind of give us a few areas that we can look into in a slightly different way. So I'm going to just go to here that gives us a little bit more detailed results. Again, this is not on a 3G connection like webpagetest.org/easy was. So the numbers are going to all generally be lower and things are going to show up as being faster. So like that 11 seconds that I was talking about before, might end up being 3.4 seconds. That's kind of, I think, 3.4 seconds here. So I'm just gonna, oops. There are these screenshots over here, and I don't think that I can interact with them. Apologies for not being 100% up on various changes that happen in Lighthouse web interface, but I'm gonna walk through it from the top, and we'll deal with what's meaningful. So Lighthouse tends to give you kind of these red triangles for things that it feels like might be areas that you should investigate a little bit more, where things are not necessarily, again, I don't want to say slow, but kind of potential red flags. So one of those areas is for CPU idle, another is time to interactive. These are kind of related. And both of these things have to do with what I was saying before about loading large JavaScript and loading a lot of JavaScript will hurt both of these metrics. First, CPU idle is a measure kind of like when the browser's JavaScript interpreter is basically quieted down, when it's done loading everything that it needs to load and it's kind of ready to say, okay, let's actually wait and see whether the user started clicking on stuff, or let's do any sort of custom logic that needs to be executed. And the more stuff that you load from potentially third parties and have to evaluate all that, the longer you're going to have to wait until you get to the point where your CPU is idle. So in this particular case, it's saying it took about 10.4 seconds for the CPU to be idle on my laptop. Obviously, it would take a little bit longer on a slower device. And similarly, time to interactive got flagged. Lighthouse thinks that it takes 12.6 seconds before the page will be fully interactive. And this, again, pretty related to CPU idle. It has to do with when Lighthouse believes that you can start clicking on the page and the browser isn't going to be busy doing other things, and it will actually allow you to respond to clicks in all of your JavaScript handlers and things like that. I'm sure we've all been frustrated by experiences where you load a site, it looks like things are ready. Everything's painted on the screen, and you start clicking around and you click on buttons and drop-down menus don't work, and things just don't respond to you actually trying to interact with the page. Which can be frustrating. Sometimes it's better to show nothing or a loading message rather than have a page that looks like it's interactive but takes 30 seconds or whatever to actually allow you to interact. So in this particular case, it takes 12.6 seconds. And so those are both areas to potentially look at. Again, like I said, looking at the JavaScript should help. Here's some opportunities. One of the things I like about Lighthouse versus web page test is I think Lighthouse is a little bit more aggressive about promoting excuse me, web platform features that are kind of on the cutting edge that might end up improving your site's performance. I think webpagetest.org is a little bit more just kind of descriptive of the raw stats and things that it found. Lighthouse might be a little bit more prescriptive of saying, hey, here are some things that you can actually improve, and it might be based on features that have just come out on the web platform in the past year or two, things that you might not necessarily know about. So here's a couple of things that end up being flagged here. One of them is deferring off-screen images. And the nice thing about this is it'll give you links to learn more. And our team on WebDevRel at Google have been trying to put together these guides to kind of give you meaningful, actionable guidance. So we're not just telling you, hey, this is a problem. We want to link out from Lighthouse to potential solutions. And this has a link about how you could use some modern techniques for lazy loading. In this particular case, though, and lazy loading, for those not familiar, just comes to the idea of not loading something that might be off screen immediately, but waiting until users scroll down a little bit, waiting until it's about to get into the viewport, and only then making the request. So it's definitely a trade-off. It's the idea of trading off upfront costs that you might spend on downloading things that aren't visible, with the fact that you might temporarily have to show a loading placeholder image or something like that when you eventually do scroll down and the user ends up wanting to interact with something later on. So it's not always the right thing to do. All of these kind of pieces of advice need to be taken within the context of your site. And let's just say lazy loading is one avenue to explore. I'm just going to put that in my notes. In this particular case, it's interesting because the things that are being flagged as candidates for lazy loading come from Google Maps. So you're not in this particular case in control over whether the individual tiles over here for Google Maps are loaded or not. What you are into control, what you do have control over is whether you actually pull in anything having to do with Google Maps or not as part of the initial page load, or if you kind of make the whole experience of loading Google Maps for the very first time, something that gets lazy loaded. So I'm just going to really quickly, and I feel like a lot of sites might think about this. I'm going to scroll all the way down here. So what I see down here is that there is a Google Maps interface. It's all the way at the bottom. I might not just be pressing the magic key combination, but it looks like I can't even really interact with Google Maps. So I think it is loading kind of like that live Google Maps embed, and maybe it's used as part of the directions. No. So I would say in this particular, like it's pulling in a lot. It's not visible when the page first loads, and honestly, you might be able to get away with just a static tile image from Google Maps rather than having this whole interactive Google Maps experience loaded that you can't really use. So that's one thing. And again, it's not exactly what it meant over here, just for off-screen images, but this was helpful, just kind of opening up this avenue to explore, and then you end up going down that path and you say, hey,
So just to clarify on that one, you're saying in that case, just get a screenshot of Google Maps, put it there in its place, like as a static image, and when you click on the image, allow the user to get through to the actual Maps experience. Might be one way if they wanted to get that to go faster.
Yes, so I want to be careful here. I'm not exactly sure what the requirements are around using Google Maps and in particular static images. I would say do not take a screenshot of the Google Maps interface, but I think I would recommend looking up the official Google Maps API documentation. I'm fairly sure that there is some way of loading a static experience rather than an interactive experience. So that is what I would explore. And if you do actually need the interactive experience for some reason, that's great. I would just point out I can't find out how to interact with it. I start clicking around, I start trying to do things. It basically just functions as a static thing right now for me. So yeah, that's one thing to look into also. So just a few other things that Lighthouse might have pointed out. I'm again going to skip over the things that I assume that's a green square, my color blindness. It's not super happy with these color choices, but I'm going to skip the squares. I'm going to focus on the triangles here. And yeah, so a couple of things here. First, web fonts. This is a tough one. Best practices around web fonts go way beyond what I feel comfortable talking about over here. And what I probably would do is, if you see something like this, first of all, click on the link. You'll get a nice explanation of how it's being evaluated and get some guidance. And I would just recommend reading through this. I know that in particular, there's a few folks in the web developer community who have really good guidance and might go beyond some of this, not to discount the quality of this guidance, but I know in particular Zach Leatherman has some, I would consider the canonical set of guidance around using web fonts and the performance implications and best practices there. So it might be worth diving into a little bit more. But with all these things in Lighthouse Audit, just starting by clicking on the Learn More link will give you a good initial set of tools to look at. Just put that. Lighthouse. Okay, I'm going to jump through a few more, and I know that we have about 10 minutes left, so the whole idea of doing multiple sites, I think, is off the table. But let's try to finish the deep dive for the first site, then, because there's always plenty to talk about. And again, even though we happen to be auditing this one particular site, I really do think nothing I saw here is a surprise for what I've seen from other sites. I think a lot of these pieces of feedback should be generally applicable. Hopefully, and folks will get something out of this whole methodology when they run through their own site audits. So, okay, this is a little bit more of attaching some numbers to things that I had mentioned earlier. which is that there is a lot of third-party JavaScript that's being loaded and that ends up blocking the main thread. In most of these particular cases, we saw from the earlier waterfall that this third-party code ends up being loaded after kind of some of the critical things are painted to the screen. So they don't necessarily affect the rendering of your screen, but what they really might affect is the time to fully interactive. So the fact that here, by loading in some of these things, like the Google Maps API, for instance, it's downloading 623 kilobytes, but the thing I would be even more concerned about is the fact that it takes, this is 150 milliseconds, so somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2 seconds of time to actually parse the JavaScript for that API, for the Google Maps API. And while your browser is doing that, if the user happens to try to interact with it, it's not going to respond. So the numbers over here are things that all contribute into kind of like this first CPU idle score over here. So loading less JavaScript, loading JavaScript only if it's going to be used, and again, by looking at the coverage tab that we saw before, that all will end up making these things go from red to green. Service stack assets. So the cache policy, we saw some of this on webpagetest.org. I don't think there's going to be too much different here. I think both of them are pretty good at showing things that were served without cache control. And minimize main thread work. We talked about all that. Here are some more numbers of just how much time broken down by different types of things the browser could be doing. The main thing about everything listed here, when this is being done, your page is not interactive, and users can get frustrated. So script evaluation is by far the biggest time spent loading less JavaScript. We'll take care of that. And getting a little redundant. This will give you the actual amount of time that is spent executing all of the different scripts. If you happen to look here and you see, hey, there's this fun widget. I have no idea. Somebody from our team added it a year ago, and I wasn't really sure if it's still useful, but I don't really want to touch my site, so I just left it there. If you happen to see that listed in the site and you say, hey, oh, actually, it's slowing my site down by 0.3 seconds for everybody, remove it. It's not going to apply for everything. There are things that you definitely need to keep on your site because they're important to some of your key business metrics, they're important to your analytics. I don't want to tell people that they have to remove those things, but this is an opportunity to revisit some of the decisions that might have been made in the past and see whether some things can be changed. One of the things I really love about Lighthouse is that it gives you a good view on accessibility best practices, which is an area I unfortunately do not always know off the top of my head. And I love seeing things flagged here that you could then go and fix. Seems like the main thing was just adding a language element to the HTML, adding a language attribute to the HTML element. This gives you some guidance here as to why it's important. Basically just follow what Lighthouse says. And a couple of other things scrolling down to the bottom. Excuse me. So this is actually a pretty good one. Part of this might be a little bit of a problem if it's not code that you control. This particular case, it looks like it's coming from something Google APIs and coming from a jQuery library. So I don't know that you're necessarily going to be able to change this. But occasionally this gets flagged in code that you do own and you could change it. And it's basically a really simple change that you can make. Over here, you'll see the more link, where if you do have listeners for different page scrolling actions, adding in this passive true at the end is basically a hint to the browser saying, hey, my event listener is never going to cancel the event, and therefore the browser could do its native scrolling thing and just give my event listener a chance to observe the event rather than the opportunity to cancel it. And not immediately obvious why this is better. Trust me that it is. Scroll listeners and touch listeners are unfortunately something that really makes the site feel janky unless you have this passive true onto it. So I would, if that does get flagged by a first-party script that you own, I would consider just making that change. Links to cross-section destinations. This is adding in an address. Sorry, adding in rel no opener or rel no refer for the reasons mentioned here. I will let you read through that if it happens to apply to your site. And this is pointing out the fact that there are some security vulnerabilities in jQuery Lodash and handlebars. No comment on that. I would basically look and see if anything does get flagged. If it does, and you have the ability to upgrade, you should upgrade. There are some SEO best practices. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm feeling you can probably spend a lot of time talking about various SEO best practices. I'm not really qualified to say much beyond what is kind of pulled out over here. I will say one last thing, because I know we're almost out of time. PWA section here kind of has to do with things that may or may not be important to your site. This is kind of what I spend my day doing, is talking about service workers and progressive web apps and ways of making your site work offline. There's a lot more that could be said about this, but unfortunately, doing some of these things that are flagged here in the progressive web app section are really not trivial. Like adding in a service worker that will make your site load all its HTML from the cache first and skip the network and things like that, can really make a huge performance improvement for your site, but it just is really not something that you can retrofit onto an existing website without a large amount of effort. So I know that various e-commerce platforms have been working on options for making, progressive web app kind of integrate very nicely into their architecture. If you happen to be using a platform and it does have progressive web app functionality via a plugin or via some sort of configuration change, I would recommend exploring that. But it's not really something that you can do in a very meaningful way with an existing, especially a server-side rendered website, without doing a decent amount of work. So I'm basically going to skip over this for now. I would say, we have a lot of information about building progressive web apps on, web.dev and various other resources, and I would recommend looking to that for the future.
Yeah, we're just at the end of time. If I was going to get you to say one last thing, in your looking around at sites, what would be like the top 3 or the top 1 issue that you would watch out for? And one that comes to mind, for example, is large images, like out of dimension images for the display space. This site looks good. I don't remember seeing anything like that, but that seems to be a fairly common sort of problem that comes up.
That is definitely a common problem. Not just large images not optimized for the resolution, but just like shipping things that are not, using JPEG with proper compression, or shipping very, very large animated GIFs instead of video files and things like that. So images do come up all the time. This particular site seems to be doing all the right things, or at least nothing that web page test flagged or Lighthouse flagged, so it's great. I would really, really say just audit the third-party JavaScript in particular that you're loading. Ask yourself whether you need to, like every widget you add to a page probably has at least, dozens of kilobytes of JavaScript, if not dozens of kilobytes of CSS that it ends up pulling in. So ask yourself whether you need everything that you currently have on your page, and with an eye towards eliminating the big JavaScript payloads. And yeah, I guess probably the other thing to look at is, whether kind of the quick wins that are flagged in Lighthouse. The 2 things I would identify as like being really quick wins are adding in the passive true to scroll listeners that you have control over. So again, it's going to be hard doing it in the jQuery source code, but if it is a scroll listener that you've written yourself, adding in passive true is a pretty easy way to make your site feel less janky. And then also adding in lazy load attributes on things that are not kind of above the fold, things that are lower down on your page. Doing lazy loading, which you can do, again, via just an attribute with some polyfills for older browsers as needed. is a really great way to make your site more responsive, because the less you're loading, the faster your site's going to be, basically.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. We're at the end of time, so I think we'll call it here. Just in terms of for future episodes, if you've got topics you'd like covered, anything to do with e-commerce, the focus of this channel is for e-commerce developers, so any APIs have got to give high priority, but we are interested in covering any Google technologies related to e-commerce and just general web technologies, because obviously websites benefit from them as well. If you go to the channel, we've created there's a discussion comment there as well. Feel free to leave comments of particular technologies you'd be interested in for future episodes. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining. This will be a regular. We're going to try keeping this on this live stream. So if you subscribe to this YouTube channel, you should get notified. If you've got any feedback on how things are going on this channel, always appreciate them. We're just getting up and going and making sure we're trying to do things right. So appreciate any feedback. Otherwise, until next week, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Cheers.